So, hello, my name is Tere, and I am one of the people who began Starsdance Mystery School a couple of years ago. We've been running a school, an online school through our Patreon, where people can sign up for different rates at different tiers and receive different material from us, all the way from daily forecasts to class materials. And we also have a part of our school, a Discord server, where we get to have conversations with each other about astrology, and everyone gets to ask questions and get their questions answered. And so that is something that we really are excited about, growing our own astrological community. I'm going to have my co-facilitators introduce themselves in a minute, but we are queer. We tend to be magical practitioners. Maybe we all consider ourselves witches, but it isn't a requirement. People can join our school without being any of those things, but that's who we are. And yeah, so we are looking for you and who's ever watching this video to join us. And you can find us on our Patreon, Stars Dance Mystery School. You can search for that and you'll find it. So I'm going to introduce myself first and then have my cohorts introduce themselves. So my name's Tare. And I've been an astrologer for a really long time. I began as a professional astrologer in the mid 90s and started studying astrology in the 80s. I do consider myself a witch, and I consider my tradition is called reclaiming witchcraft tradition, which is an activist tradition. It's a tradition that is really we engage our magic with, changing our own selves, but also the world, and making a more just and equitable world. And so that tends to filter into my astrology quite a bit. I love to teach, and I've been teaching for a while. Um, and really, the goal of this particular workshop is to help people just step right in for the first time into looking at a chart. So if you have questions about, I don't know what I'm looking at, we hope to give you the answers to those questions tonight. So that's me for tonight. Yeah, who would like to introduce themselves next?
I can go. And everyone else, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat too, and tell us where you're coming from, and feel free to share your sun, moon, and rising. My name is Bonnie May. I've been a witch for a really long time. I know Tere and Penske through the reclaiming branch of witchcraft, which is like witchcraft infused with activism. And I've gotten into astrology since the beginning of the pandemic. Actually, TikTok got me to astrology, strangely enough, but then I went a lot deeper with Stardance, and I study a bit of traditional and a bit of modern. And I really enjoy electional astrology, which is what I do for Stardance, picking like opportune dates with astrology for doing certain things, whether it's activism or magical working or just like getting a good haircut. So if you're interested in that, that's what I do on Stardance the most, and also other things, but feel free to send me any questions there at Stardance about electional astrology. I would love to chat about that. And I'll pass it off to Penske.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, Tare. My name is Penske, magical last name, Pocket Knife. And I use they, them pronouns. And I have been studying astrology for about the last decade. I always knew growing up that I was a Cancer, and didn't really resonate with that. And then I was having a particularly hard time, both in my relationship and also with a legal case I was dealing with. And I found these astrology books and discovered that I was more than just my sun, and astrology started really clicking for me. So I'm hoping that some of y'all will have the same experience. Things will start clicking for you. And at the mystery school, I joined as a student at the beginning of the pandemic, and then eventually became a co-facilitator of chart reflections, which is something that Tara and I facilitate 2 Mondays a month, the first and the third Mondays. And so that is where a volunteer offers their chart to us, and then we go through reading it with our students. And so that's a great thing to be able to access both as a volunteer, if you'd like to let us look at your chart with students, but also amazing thing that the astrology school offers to actually be able to take that time to learn about how do you actually go through a chart step by step, how do you actually tailor a reading to the client's actual questions too. Where do you start to look for different answers within the chart? And I think that's it. Yeah, welcome. Nice to be here with all y'all.
Thanks, Penske. Thanks for talking about chart reflections. I really like that part of what we do. And I think it's a really great thing because I know when I was learning astrology, I wanted that a lot and I couldn't find it. No one offered that sort of instruction of how do you actually talk to a real person about their chart. So that's what we try to do. So we are going to talk tonight about like the very basics of the chart, and our goal is to have this conversation be conversational, and that we're all three different people. We'll use astrology in different ways sometimes, and in the same way sometimes, and so we really want to get to those times that we maybe have different ideas or use astrology in different ways, and I think we'll have a little bit of that tonight too when we look at a chart. I'm just going to go ahead and share a chart that we're going to use as an example as we look at the parts of a chart.
Okay. And let me say first, too, I think maybe all of y'all heard this already, but feel free to put questions into the chat. I will be tracking your questions throughout this workshop. And if it's a question that I think needs to be answered, someone else coming, in the moment as we're in the topic, I'll go ahead and bring it up then. And then if I don't bring up your question, I'll bring it up at the end when we do questions and answers. So I'm tracking you. Your question hasn't been forgotten. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Penske.
Mhm.
All right. So here we are. Going to look at this diagram of a chart. And we're going to just tell you what we're seeing here. So you see a circle, and the circle describes the 360 degrees. That's what a circle, that's how many degrees are in a circle, 360 degrees. And that comes in handy when you later as we get into the parts of it. But a circle is 360 degrees, and that's the whole sky all the way around us. So what you see here is a circle, and you can see these little wedges and these numbers going around on the inside, which refer to the houses. So when you talk about a house of a chart, we're talking about this is the first house here, the second, third, fourth. So the houses go in this direction in order. You know, that's the 1 through 12. There are 12 houses in a chart. And what you're seeing are some houses have things inside of them and some houses don't. And the things that we're looking at, most of them are planets. And each of the planets has a particular glyph or symbol of that planet. And it's really a great idea if you're really a beginner to start memorizing the glyphs. The glyphs, which are the symbols for the planets, and then also the glyphs for the signs. So what we're seeing here is the circle with a dot in the middle, that's the sun. That's the glyph for the sun. And then the number here is 12 degrees for the sun. And then the next glyph is the sign. And so the glyph, this is the sign for Taurus. And then the little numbers that we see after the bigger numbers are the minutes in the degree. So I just said that a circle has 360 degrees and we have 12 signs. So when we divide 360 degrees by 12, we get 30 degrees. So every sign is 30 degrees. And so every degree has within it 60 minutes. You know, we kind of just break it down into parts. So the bigger number is what I usually sort of look at more than the littler number. But if we get really fine-tuned on the exact position, we're going to want to know what the degree number is and the minute number. So for instance, the sun is at 12 degrees, Taurus, 28 minutes. And that is just that very beginning piece. Is there anything about that that, you know, I missed about degrees and division of the chart, Penske and Bonnie, that you're wanting to refer to? No? We also have another thing in our chart that's included in a lot of different astrological schools. And thanks, Bonnie, for saying that you practice a traditional and modern style of astrology. And I am a modern astrologer, which means that I learned astrology in the 80s. And that is has a slight different focus than the traditional model, or maybe a slight different set of tools. But those tools I'm finding more and more can be blended and used together, and that's what we really are interested in. And so, yes, I am coming from that modern perspective of a chart. And so, as I said, there were different schools of thought in astrology. And but most of them use this point right here, which is called the north node of the moon. And we're going to see that always directly opposite the north node will be the south node. So this is a place in the chart that's not a planet. It's not a body in space. It's a point in space. And we might not get into the interpretation of nodes, but they do have to do with the Earth's orbit and the moon's orbit intersecting. And sometimes the nodes will point to where eclipses happen. And so they become really important points to consider. So we look at planets in a chart, we look at the nodes. Yeah, so as you can see, we can see that in any given moment in the sky, some parts of the chart will be empty. That doesn't mean that those parts of your life aren't important. You know, we have other ways of looking at the importance or the meaning in those empty houses. One of them is the other part of the chart. As you can see, there are signs along, there's glyphs, and these are glyphs for signs of the zodiac along the outside wheel. And so this is the sign for Leo on the cusp of the first house. Because this is a chart that we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but this is a Placidus House System. And a Placidus House System, you can have Leo, say, on two cusps of a chart at the same time. So we call the lines that begin the houses cusps, C-U-S-P-S. And the sign that is on the beginning. So, you know, as you look at how these numbers go in this direction, we can say that's the beginning of the first house. This is the beginning of the second house. This is the beginning of the third house. The beginning is the cusp, and we see Leo here. So even though Leo, the first house is empty, this is the house of identity, for example, we're going to look at what rules that sign. And we know that the sun rules that sign. And so then we're going to get more information about those empty houses. And we may not get into all of the details of rulership and the meaning of rulership of signs. but that's another technique in astrology that's a really important tool to find meaning. So as I said, we've got, these are cusps. And you can see that we also use this degrees here. So the first house in this particular chart starts at 0 degrees and 30 minutes. So a sign in astrology is 30 degrees, but we don't start with the number 1. We start with the number 0, and we end with the number 29. And then we'll get a few more minutes of that sign, and then we'll start the next sign with 0. And this is an example of how the first degree of Leo is 0 degrees Leo. And so as you can see, going around the wheel, that the cusp in the Placidus House System will start in different degrees, different numbers. There is another part of this system. When we use this Placidus House System, we might get an intercepted sign. That's what this is right here, Capricorn. So what this is saying is that the sign of Capricorn doesn't occur on a cusp. We have the 6th house here, starting at 28 degrees Sagittarius, and then it ends at 0 degrees Aquarius, 30 minutes. And the sign of Capricorn is in between those two signs, in between those 2 points. And when a sign doesn't appear on a cusp, we say it's intercepted. And this is a technique, and this is a quality of house systems that are whole house systems. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later too. Is there anything else that you're noticing in this chart that I should say, or is there anything that I just said that people didn't understand? And it's your time to ask us in the chat. Did that all make sense to you, Bonnie? And
Yeah, I'll ask one question just because when we talk about house systems later, this will probably come up. But for Placidus, and we'll get to this later, but the angles, they kind of start at the cusp of that house. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
that is the quality of this type of chart. It's called Placidus. And another way to say what the Placidus system is it's a quadrant-based chart. And that means that the angles begin houses. But we will talk about that a little bit later. We're going to get into that part. Maybe it'll make more sense then. Yeah. Another thing that we see in this chart is in the middle here. These are called aspects. And an aspect is the way, a particular geometric distance that 2 points or planets are apart from each other that make a particular relationship between those planets. And we have different kinds of aspects. We're actually teaching a class right now about aspects, and you can sign on to our Patreon and learn all about aspects. But as these little lines in here are showing us that, say for instance, Mars and Chiron, that's what Chiron is, are square each other because there's a little square symbol in there. And then we've got Venus at 22 Taurus and Neptune at 22 Pisces are sextile each other. That's a different kind of energy. And it's telling us, aspect actually comes from the word seeing, and it's how the planets see each other and what they feel about that. You know, it's a dialogue between the planets. Is it a happy relationship or is it contentious? Is there conflict or challenge in that relationship? And those aspects are going to tell us that. And that's where we get a lot more of that rich story that can come from a chart. So most charts will have some system of showing us the aspects. And I think a little bit later, I'll even show an aspectarian as another way to see aspects in a chart. So anything else that people are noticing about the parts of a chart? We're gonna get into these points, ascendant, descendant, midheaven, and nadir in just a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I'd just like to say a couple things. one, just these signs, the signs that are on the cusps of the houses, they always go in the same order. Maybe you already knew that, but it's always in the same order. And so that's another thing that when you're learning astrology, you just gotta learn, gotta learn glyphs and gotta learn the order, but it won't ever deviate from that, you know? Taurus is always going to come after Aries. Gemini is always going to come after Taurus. And so that's something you can rely on.
Mhm.
And
Right.
then as you start to practice more astrology and look at more and more charts, you'll see the planets can be just spread all over the charts, all over that 360 degrees. And so that's another thing you'll get a taste for as you look at a chart in the first glance, be like, oh wow, these planets are all kind of like next to each other, or wow, they're all really spread out. And so even before you learn about all the different types of charts, you'll start to get kind of a flavor for the way that they can all look. They can be so different.
They really can. Right.
Mhm.
Okay, I think I'm gonna stop the share here. Do you have anything else to add about this chart right now? We're gonna come back to it, Bonnie, but I think I'll stop the share now. And I am going to open up my astrology software and show you how I calculate a chart. Let's see, here it is. So I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so I use Astro Gold. It's the software that I use because I have an Apple computer. And what you're looking at right now is another chart with all those parts that we just talked about. We've got the planets in there and the houses and the aspects. And I am going to show you how to create a chart. So this is where you would put in the name, and we're just going to do transits because that's the default here. And it's today, August 8th, 2022. We need to know that. And then the time is going to be, I'm going to select now. And you see that the time has changed. It's now 6:58. We need a place. We need to know the location of a chart. And so I've got Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my program will automatically fill in the latitude and longitude of that place, which is important. And then I'm choosing the tropical zodiac, which means that it's the system of how we place planets and signs. And there's a couple of different systems. And tropical is the sign is the system that's used in the West most often, regardless of whether you're a modern astrologer or a traditional astrologer. The other system would be sidereal, which is used in Vedic astrology. And so that's another way to place the planets and signs. So just choose tropical if you're going to go with what is mostly done in the West. And then you get to choose a house system. And just to show you, there's tons of different house systems. So that's a topic that you need to decide when you're learning astrology is what house system am I going to gravitate towards? And then I press calculate. And we're going to see that we get a chart that shows us that we have Capricorn on the ascendant at 18 degrees, and that the planet Pluto is right here. It's about to rise up. And Penske's going to tell us more about this point here that's called the ascendant in just a minute. But I also wanted to show you that we have this piece. This is the same chart, but we're also looking at this triangle here, which is called an aspectarian. And getting that in there so you can see the whole thing. This is another way to look at aspects, and it's giving us some more details because there are the numbers down here, which is showing us how exact or far apart.
Here, the aspectarian's not showing up on my screen. I don't know if other folks can see it.
What are you seeing?
I just see the chart.
Oh,
what you were showing us before, but not the aspectarian.
Okay, I see. All right, it's not letting me. I'm gonna stop the share and then I'll select that particular. Thank you for telling me that.
Mhm.
Okay, so here we go again. So this is the triangle, the aspectarian, which is another way to show, give us information about these aspects in here. For instance, we can see here that Mars is square the sun, because we see the line that's saying with a little square symbol in there. So those are more glyphs to learn, or the aspect glyphs. But over here we can look at Mars, and we go across to Mars and we go up from the sun and we see, yep, Mars is square the sun. And these numbers mean that there's 6 degrees approaching. The A stands for the aspect is approaching. And so Mars, the sun is moving into since the sun moves faster than Mars, the sun's moving into a square with Mars in a few days. And the distance from being exact is 6 degrees and 43 minutes. So that's what those numbers are. As you can see, we have A's for approaching. That means it's getting ready to be exact. And separating is the S, which means it's already exact and it's moving away from being exact. And we can see here that Jupiter is trine the sun, and that it's 7 degrees and 54 minutes away from that. Is there anything else about this that people notice that I should mention? Or we're not going to get into the details of interpretation of those things. We just want you to know this is what you're looking at when you look at a chart. Right? There's a lot of interpretation that comes in. That's the craft. First, you've got to know what the map is. Yes. So,
Yeah. Oh, I like what you said about the glyphs. And there's also the glyphs for the aspects, like the triangles, trine, squares, square. But yeah, I think that's something I forget to mention with people learning astrology for the first time, is that the glyphs are kind of like the ABCs. So you have to like learn those before you can look at a chart.
it actually unlocks it in just some sort of mysterious way. You know, it feels like, well, I don't really need to learn the glyphs, but there's just some kind of magical thing that happens when you learn them. I do feel like other sacred sigils and things of power. I also use the glyphs quite a bit in my magic. And if anyone's familiar with sigil magic, it's like it's very potent to know what the glyphs are. So I recommend that a lot. Yeah, so we're going to talk about birth time. Bonnie's going to talk about that.
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, so I just wanted to share a bit of context of like why the birth time is so important. I think Camino here knows my rant about birth time, but when we're looking at a birth chart, the birth time really gives us more information about like the rising time, because the rising sign does change every 2.5 hours. So I know that when people like talk about their birth time and they get like an estimate from their parents, it seems like, oh yeah, I'm definitely a Sagittarius rising, for example. But I had an instance where I asked my mom my birth time and I had a weird feeling about it being off. And I ended up having a dream about it and ordering a copy of my birth certificate. And her memory was just off by 33 minutes, but it pushed me from like a late Sagittarius rising to a 1-degree Capricorn rising. So whenever I'm looking at people's charts and they're giving me a birth time, I like to ask them, like, is this from a birth certificate or is it from like a time estimate, especially if the degree of their ascendant is like at 29 degrees of Libra, for example. And there's also, I don't think there's anything wrong if you don't know, because it is kind of a privilege to have like an exact birth time. Some people might be adopted, or maybe they just don't have access. Like there are some states in the United States, for example, that they don't always have the birth time on the birth certificate. And then there's also hospitals that round up and things like that. So there are some things that, you know, it's just really hard to control it fully, but it's a good idea to give the astrologer a heads up. You're like, oh, this is like an estimate for my mom, I'm not sure. And then, you know, if you don't know, but if you have like a ballpark figure, you can let them know. And some astrologers do specialize in, they call it chart rectification, where they're helping you kind of map out your life with the possible rising times, rising signs, and they'll help give you a better idea of like, oh, this one seems more likely with the events that happened in your life. So that's just something to consider when you're thinking of your birth time and, you know, giving it to an astrologer.
I have found that to be true, that because people don't realize how important it is, they just feel like, oh, an estimate is fine. And it's really good to notice that a degree can change, like the ascendant, you know, maybe one's ascendant is at 3 degrees Sagittarius. 4 minutes later, only 4 minutes later, it'll be 4 degrees Sagittarius. And like in your instance, Bonnie, it can change if the ascendant was close to the end of a sign, just a few minutes would make it a different sign altogether. So yeah, it is important, and people don't realize that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen some where it was just 1 minute difference would have changed it. I'm like, okay, I need to know, was this from a birth certificate or was it not? I just want to know. And then that way, if they're not sure, we can kind of consider the 2 different rising signs at least.
Yes. And then there's a way, you know, that there's people, I will look at a people's chart and cast it for noon, just like we have no idea. And then be aware that you can't judge the houses at all or the ascendant, like you don't know what that is. And also that the moon in a 24-hour period can move up to 13, 14 degrees. So you kind of split that number in half and say, I'll cast a noon chart and I'll say the moon is either 7 degrees before that or 7 degrees after that. So that gives you some more information. But
Yeah, the moon is a good idea too. I forgot to mention that. If I have someone that doesn't have their birth time, but they want to look at like, what is my moon? I'll take note of that. And if it's something where the moon does change, I'll give them the 2 options and kind of like see what they feel about that.
yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that if you don't have an exact birth time and it's not possible for you to get an exact birth time, there's still so much information you can get from your astrology chart. It's like all the placements of the planets, you know, the modalities, the elements. There's just certain things that won't be accessible to you, but you as an astrologer might come across people who just can't get their exact birth time, and it does bum people out. So I just like to say that not all is lost. There's still so much, so many parts of astrology. So there's still a lot of richness that you can get.
There is, I think. Yeah. So yes, I'm going to go back to sharing a chart to just talk about a little piece, another orientation to what we're looking at. And this is like the daily motion of the sun and yearly motion of the sun. So when we're looking at, like Penske said earlier, you know, the signs of the zodiac as they go around this wheel in this direction, counterclockwise, are in the order of the signs through the year. So we have Leo, and then the next sign will be Virgo, and the next sign will be Libra, and that's just the way it goes. And this direction is how the sun moves through a year. So it will take the sun a year to go through all these different signs. So we kind of say this is the year, the houses are describing the yearly motion of the sun, and that's why they go in this direction. And that what we're looking at for the daily motion of the sun is how this ascendant is the point in the east, and it's where the sun rises. This is all below ground, And so the sun sets over here, and this is midnight, and then this is um, sunrise, and this is noon. And this is the direction that the sun moves in a day, as well as all the other planets. So during the course of the day, we can see Mars is here. Later on in the day, it's going to be here. Later on in the day, it's going to set over here. Later on in the day, it'll be down here. So that's how the planets move every day. They circle around us, and it's based on because the Earth is turning. But astrology sort of has this this idea that the Earth is fixed and the sky is moving, and it still works even though it's not true. Uh, and so that's why we have two motions in a chart. We're looking at two kinds of motions, and because of the daily motion of the sun, we have particular meanings to those points. And Penske was going to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. And I just wanted to add on to that, like as the sun moves through the day, it's like all the houses, you're just imagining the entire chart is gonna turn. So it's the sun will stay in the same sign, or the planets will stay in their same sign, and just the entire chart will seem to shift. Because what's gonna change is that degree of the ascendant. So every 2 hours, there's a different, and the next sign is on that ascendant point.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to talk about the points in a chart. So if we think about the chart as a map, right, it's so important to understand like where it's north, where's south, where's east, where's west. And so the four most important points in a chart are the ascendant, which is over here on the left, which is where the sun rises, where planets rise. So it's also called the rising. And that corresponds to the constellation that was rising on the eastern horizon when you were born. So it's really cool. It's like this also, when we're looking at astrology charts, it's also just an actual map of what the planets were doing when you were born. So it's really cool. It's like, oh, if you had seen eastern horizon at the moment you were born, that's the constellation that would have been more or less right there. So we have the ascendant, and across from it, we have the descendant. So all the way to the right of the chart, kind of at the west, or the place where the sun and the planets sink below the horizon. And then we have the nadir, or you'll also see it referred to as the IC, or the inum colum, fully. And it means below. In Latin, it means below Earth. And then at the top, you have the midheaven. So then the highest point in the chart. And so I'm going to go through them one by one. Thanks for coming, David. All right. So the ascendant, or your rising, is like the energy that is rising out of you. It's some of the first energy that comes across to people and how they read you. It can be your personal style. It can be what sets you apart from other people, just how you stand out. And it's all about identity. And so the ways that you are different from everyone else. And then on the other side is the descendant. So the descendant, if we think of the ascendant as you and your identity, the descendant it can still be parts of you, but parts of you that you don't recognize as much. And so you see them in other people and you're drawn to them in other people. It can also be relationships that you are drawn towards, the types of people that complement you. But it can also be, like our shadow side, the parts of us that we have a harder time accessing, and sometimes seek out other people to help us bring those parts forward. And so it's not an energy that we so much associate with ourselves the way that we would with the ascendant or the rising. And then, so the way that the ascendant and the descendant go together kind of as a pair that complement each other, so do the nadir and the midheaven. So if you think about the sun, right? So the sun is going to be at the highest point in the day. It's going to be on that midheaven. So the midheaven is our public self. You think about like the parts of you that people see who don't even really know you. They just see you moving around, doing your thing. And they're like, oh, there's that person that is really good at writing, or that person is an excellent teacher. It can be our career. Some people, for them, the ways that they make money and the things that they feel really drawn to do, their passions, their ambitions, those things don't always go together. For some people, they do go together. And so the midheaven is where we might see someone's career and career path. But for other people, it might be just their kind of life goals, their ambitions, their passions, and what they're known for in the world.
Mm.
So this point, the midheaven goes together with the nadir. So the nadir, that is the deepest, most hidden part of our chart. Think about when planets are down in the lower hemisphere, the lower part of our chart, they're under the earth. It's the dark time. And so those planets aren't as easily seen. And so the nadir, in a similar way, it's like our private selves, who we are when we're in our homes, when we feel really comfortable, when we feel like we can just let everything down, let loose. And it goes together with that public self, because you think about, to be that public self, there's parts of you that you're hiding. I'm not going to cry while I'm at work, or maybe you do have a situation where you can't cry at work, and that's great. If that's what you want. But for a lot of people to like follow their career ambitions, they have to kind of put aside certain parts of them. And so those parts are being met by the nadir. Those are like the deeper nurturing anchors that then let us reach for these other parts of ourselves and other ambitions. See. And they have to do each of these points, like Tere was talking about, they're at the cusps of the houses in the Placidus system. So the ascendant is the cusp of the first house, and the first house is all about identity. So it kind of starts out that identity energy. The nadir is at the cusp of the fourth house. And the fourth house is all about home and nurturance, chosen family, it can be biological family. Then the descendant starts out the seventh house, and the seventh house is all about one-to-one relationships, people that we do projects with, more of those didactic kind of, or dyadic back and forth sort of relationships, the one-to-one. And then the midheaven starts out the 10th house, and the 10th house is about our public self, our career, our passions and ambitions. And so when a planet, a thing that you'll start to look at as you read charts or read your own chart, is when there are planets on any of those 4 points. And that's where you'll use those little numbers next to the planetary glyph. Like in this one, this example, so we see over by the descendant, there is the moon is at 28 degrees Capricorn. The descendant is at 0 degrees Aquarius. So it's called like an out of sign conjunction, which we don't have to get into because they're different signs. But you can see the moon is really close to that descendant. So the moon, what that planet represents, like our inner self, deeper feelings, nurturance, it's going to have something to do with like the kinds of people we're drawn towards. Like maybe we really want to be with people that we feel really safe with, or people who are more in touch with their emotions. So you start to, that's like another interpretive piece. So you just look at if there's planets on those points. Yeah. With Tere or Bonnie, do you want to add anything about the angles?
I think that's great. Yeah. Do you have anything? I know we're going to talk in a little bit about the different house systems, and that might be where you talk, Bonnie, a little bit more about how the angles fall in different houses. in different systems.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like that for the point of view of the Placidus chart, that was really great. I don't have anything else to say. So
And
thanks.
and feel free, we haven't gotten any questions yet, but if
Yeah.
any clarification or have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat.
Okay.
Check.
So I have a question for you, Bonnie. You're going to talk about the metaphor of planets and signs and houses. Do you want to have refer to this chart as an example to look at, or do you want me to just take it away?
No, I'm totally fine with this chart. Yeah, when we talk about house systems later, maybe it'd be helpful to look at a whole sign chart, but I think this is totally fine for talking about the planets and signs. So I think I'll start off by saying that I feel like when most people are introduced to astrology, at least for me, I hear about the sun sign, and like for me, my sun is in Scorpio, and that's all I knew about myself. And then later on, I started to learn that there are other planets like your moon sign, your rising sign. And one way that I like to think about these metaphors is that this is like a map, like Tere and Penske were pointing out, like this entire chart is a map of who you are. And so I like to orient myself with what the planets are doing. I also think that the planets they tend to be more, to me, more of the primary factors in a chart than the signs. Like the signs are kind of what the planets are, like kind of like the character the planet is playing. So I like to use the metaphor of that the planets are the actors in your chart. So for example, Mars is going to tend to be about things like conflict and aggression and getting what you want, whereas Venus will be more about how you relate to others, how you get along with others, or how you express like love and caring. And then the sun is kind of like more of our larger identity, whereas the moon could be more like um, how we want to be supported and feel safe, especially people we feel close with. But the signs are going to be like how that planet is playing out that role. So for example, with this chart, we have the sun in Taurus. So this might be someone who like their kind of values, and their values might be really important to them. And that's something they share with the world, of like this kind of earthly sustainable energy of like, these are my values, these are important. I'm going to kind of stick with them, and I'm going to very consistently move through life and protect my values, for example. But you also have this moon in Capricorn, and that has a different kind of energy of more like maybe someone who is a little more emotionally guarded, because Capricorn can be someone who's like just going out into the world and being ambitious and doing what they need to do to achieve what they want. So it might be someone that since it is the moon, it is going to be about emotional security, but maybe they're a little more guarded, and maybe they need to know that they have security, like physical security, earthly security, before they can open up, for example. But all the planets, they are going to do the same thing. Like Mars is still going to do Mars things, Venus is still going to do Venus things. But the signs are just going to kind of give some character and definition to how they're doing it. So I like that metaphor of the planets being the actors, the signs being this, the roles they're playing. And so depending on what sign they're in, they're going to display that. They're going to display that action in a different way. And then I also like to think of the houses as the settings in a play. So the first house is like the area of like identity and like how you're showing up like as your personal identity. But the fourth house, for example, might be how you show up in the home life. So that can be where the planets are actors and the signs are the roles they're playing. The house is like the setting that they're in. And then lastly, what Tara was mentioning before when we were talking a little bit about aspects, that's kind of the way that the planets are talking to each other. So how the sun, for example, is talking to the moon. They're both in earth signs. They kind of have this like flowing energy. That's a type of aspect. It's called a trine, because they're both in the same element. And that just kind of displays like what kind of conversation they're having. So you can kind of think of it as like the drama in a play. So for example, in another case, we have Saturn in Aquarius, And the sun in Taurus, that's a square. So that's kind of a more tense relationship. So maybe the sun and Saturn are kind of yelling at each other or like not getting along or bumping heads a little bit. Whereas like maybe the moon and the sun are getting along really easily. So when you look at the entire chart as like a map and you see all the different conversations the planets are having with each other, it gets really detailed and very nuanced, and you can see how each person is like really unique and has different things going on with their chart. Is there anything I missed there or any examples I should give?
No, yeah, you know, the setting, you know, like you said, with the houses. So Saturn is in the house of relationship. So it's
Mhm.
like that planet of discipline, and it's in a sign of intellect, and it's squaring the sun, and you know, in the setting of career. And so you just start to layer in. You layer in, and this is how I learned astrology. You know, you kind of just compile the symbols and then start to tell a story, and it takes a while, but in the very beginning you can just start to ask questions and start to investigate as you talk to people about their charts. How does this show up actually in your life? Which is another plug to come to Chart Reflections, because that's what we do. So we tell the story.
Mhm.
But yeah, this is a great way to layer in all of the nuance and relationship in a chart and get to it.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the share of this, and we've got one more topic to talk about, which is sort of the difference between house systems. We've referred to them, and now we're going to get a little bit deeper into what that means for tonight. So, whoops, I didn't do that right. Let's stop the share and do it again. There we are. Here is two charts side by side. Can you see them both?
Yes, or I
Okay.
can.
On the
Yeah.
left
Yep.
is, these are the same charts cast for the same moment, but the difference is that we're using two different house systems. On the left, this is the whole sign house system that's used in traditional astrology, Hellenistic astrology especially. And then on the right is Placidus, or a quadrant-based system. And we're going to just kind of like look a little bit at the differences, but I thought maybe Bonnie would like to talk about why she uses this system, the whole sign.
Yeah. Yeah. So like you said, the whole sign house system is used in Hellenistic astrology. It's considered one of the oldest house systems, or maybe the oldest one, but it is quite different from Placidus because you'll notice that there are, oh wait, can you hear me? Okay, cool. You'll notice that when you look at the two charts, that there are some planets that are in one house or the other for each one. And whole sign, another way of calling it is an equal house system where each each house is ruled by one zodiac sign. So there's no starting at a certain degree. Each of them starts at 0 degrees of Capricorn, 0 degrees of Aquarius, and so on. So each of the houses is going to be about the same size, and it's all going to be ruled by one zodiac sign. And I use it mostly because when I got into astrology, I came in during like basically the boom of Hellenistic astrology, where all this stuff was being translated and there was all this new information. And I just like learning really old things. But I think like all the house systems are good for different techniques, and Hellenistic astrology and whole sign, there's like certain timing techniques that they're really good for, but they're all like each house system does different things, and you can look at the same chart in a slightly different way. And I really recommend just like kind of trying out your own birth chart in different house systems, which for me doesn't really change that much. So I just kind of went with the techniques, but for some people, their chart does change a bit between house systems. So you can kind of experiment with it, see how it feels. Like for example, this person here, whoever they are, and whole sign, they have the moon in Aquarius in their second house. And then in the Placidus chart, they have their moon in Aquarius in the first house. So that you can kind of see how that feels. Like, do I feel like my sense of security and my moon in Aquarius is more in the second house of finances, or do I feel like it's more like front and center with my identity? Like which one feels more right to me? And you can kind of play around with it and see which one feels right to you.
Mhm. Yeah, I also have a philosophy of I just believe that both systems can be used and for different reasons. So it isn't necessary. And this is a philosophy we have at Starsdance is that we're not teaching just one thing. Um, and we're really exploring together and discovering together. You know, there's one person who's in our school who has characterized the quadrant-based house system like Placidus as an internal, more psychological description, whereas the traditional whole sign is more of an external
Hmm.
expression of a chart, which I think is really intriguing. And so there's different ways to play with both ideas. But I also want to point out why I am so attached to Placidus is we talked about the angles last time, and as the meaning of the angles are so significant to the houses that they begin in the quadrant base. And what we mean by quadrant, like Placidus, is that the angles begin the houses that they pertain to. So the ascendant will always begin the first house. Whereas in a whole sign, the ascendant can be somewhere in the middle of the first house. And it especially becomes important with the nadir and the midheaven because um, in Placidus, the nadir will always be the beginning of the fourth house. Whereas in this example of whole sign, the nadir or the IC is, as Penske mentioned, it's also called, is in the fifth house. And that means that the midheaven is also in the fifth house. Now, this does not mean that there isn't really valid and rich interpretation that we can have with moving the midheaven and nadir into different houses. But I just really understand the way they work with quadrant based. It's just like it just resonates for me to put the midheaven at the beginning of the 10th house. But you know, I know different astrologers will add in the meaning of the 11th house to what the midheaven is showing us. And so we would interpret the sign of the midheaven, which is Scorpio, and then we'd interpret that additional house, which is the 11th, into the meaning. So it's not right or wrong. We are not like interested in right and wrong, but we are interested in like what's it telling us. Is there anything else about the house systems that we haven't mentioned? Is anybody curious about this?
No, I just wanted to weigh in where I stand with it, you know. Um, I think it is really good to as an astrologer just figure out which one works best for you. And I see the sense in committing to one. I personally have never committed to one. So when I give readings to people, I generally ask them, do you want whole sign or Placidus? Do you care? And then I usually just do Placidus. But I find whole sign really helpful in just being kind of like a community astrologer and meeting someone at a gathering and being like, cool, what's your rising? Oh, okay, Saturn's in your fifth house right now. Cool, it might be showing up this way. It's a way that you can, if you have down the houses and the order of the signs, you can just calculate a chart in your head. And so for some people, it's like, oh, I'm never going to actually give them a reading, but I might be able to tell them something useful in this moment. And it's just interesting for me as I'm out in the world to start gathering information of like, oh, okay, this person's feeling that Saturn transit in their seventh house. This one's more in the 10th. So that's why I like whole sign. And those intercepted signs kind of bother me. But that Placidus does, like in this one, this person has very small little Pisces area, very small little Virgo area. But I don't like the way that with whole sign, the IC and the MC can get so skewed. So, for me, neither one is perfect, or or works perfectly for me. I just use them at different times and don't find any issue really in reconciling them for myself.
Mhm.
Right. And the reason that the calculations show up differently is a very complex,
Yeah.
very complex mathematics that I'm not capable of really describing. But if you're a mathematical person, it's really interesting how over time, Placidus is it developed quite a while ago, centuries ago. So it's not like it's just was developed, in the 80s or something. But it's a really sophisticated way, I think, of dividing up the sphere. That is, it's not just a circle, actually, it's a sphere where we are in space. And so, astrologers were really trying to grapple with this idea of where does the midheaven fall. And so it isn't a perfect solution because we are in a sphere. Then we're looking at a map that is flat. But, maybe we'll evolve into being able to see that sphere. And I think some house systems are really trying to get more spherical. So, but I'm not an expert in that. I just know that I've been using Placidus most of my astrology career. I think it's important to know why the charts look different from each other.
Totally.
Mhm.
So
And I
this
will
is-
say that was not that Placidus chart didn't look like some other Placidus charts where the line of the midheaven and nadir will like tilt, and the program will actually make the houses different sizes because of that. It will make some houses look really small and some houses look really big. So just
Mhm.
be surprised if you're looking at a chart and you're like, whoa, why is it all slanted
yeah.
in these directions? And just that has to do with, like Tara was saying, the complicated math and astronomy of where on the planet you were actually born to, like the angle of the sun and the planets. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
That's why the location is also important, not just
exactly.
Yeah. Like if you're born closer to the equator, the chart's going to look very different in Placidus
Mhm.
than someone further away from the equator.
Right.
Yeah.
So we really welcome questions right now. Thanks for tuning in. We'll just give you a
Mhm.
couple of minutes. If there's anything we said that didn't make sense to you, we'd like to give you that chance to ask your question now.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Bye, Pip.
Thanks for coming, Kip.
Yeah.
All right. It looks like we don't. So thanks for joining us.
It-
I will send out a recording of this to our participants and join us.
Yeah. I hope this was helpful for everyone and getting like an idea of like where to start with your astrology journey.
Absolutely. I hope so too.
Yeah.
Thanks
Yeah.
for joining me, Penske and Bonnie.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And it would be lovely to have any of you on Chart Reflections, and you can find the form to sign up for that on our Patreon.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you, you three. Have a good rest of your day.
Have a good night.